Another aspect of local knowledge had to do with the fact that children grew up surrounded by people who knew them deeply, who knew them intimately, and who accepted them just the way they were. So they were not segregated into separate age groups, put into a system that was training them to constantly be better and better, and to train in an unnatural way to be producers in an unhealthy economy, an exploitative economy, both environmentally and socially exploitative. So what I came to realize was that perhaps in terms of mental health and human well-being, maybe the single most important thing was growing up surrounded by a group of people, all who, who valued you, who saw you for who you were, unique individual. There was a genuine individualism, genuine to the point where not only did they know you, with your name and so on, but they knew that you were changing from moment to moment, from year to year as you grew. So this deep, ongoing, intimate, localized knowledge of one another, it gave people what I think we all want, which is a sense of being connected and valued for who we are on the inside.
I'm Olivia Clementine, and this is Love and Liberation. Today our guest is Helena Norberg-Hodge. Helena is an author and filmmaker and a pioneer of the local economy movement. Through writing and public lectures on 3 continents, she has been promoting an economics of personal, social, and ecological well-being for more than 40 years. She is author of Ancient Futures and Local is Our Future. She is co-author of Bringing the Food Economy Home and From the Ground Up, as well as producer of the award-winning documentary, The Economics of Happiness. Helena is the founder and director of Local Futures and the International Alliance for Localization, and a founding member of the International Commission on the Future of Food and Agriculture, the International Forum on Globalization, and the Global Eco-Village Network. A linguist by training, she speaks 7 languages and was the first outsider in modern times to master the ancient Tibetan dialect of Ladakh. Since 1975, she has worked with the people of Ladakh, also known as Little Tibet, to find ways of enabling their culture to meet the modern world without sacrificing social and ecological values. For these efforts, she was awarded the Right Livelihood Award, or Alternative Nobel Prize. She was awarded the prestigious Goy Peace Prize in 2012. Well, thank you, Helena, for coming here today. So grateful to have you. And I wanted to just jump into the basics of the current economy and how we came here, essentially. And so how is the modern economy of comparative advantage different than the economic system that came before?
Yeah, well, before that, we had a multitude of different systems as people had adapted to different climates, to the differences in soil, to the differences in the amount of water and winds and different species that were adapted to these different environments. So we had this amazing, rich cultural diversity that was a reflection of the biological, ecological diversity on this planet. Many of those cultures, as we know, didn't keep a perfect balance with the environment. There are records of earlier civilizations that ended up destroying their environment and destroying themselves. But I think we don't have much, we haven't paid much attention to the fact that there are also records of much more sustainable ancient cultures, a multitude of cultures that were actually able to thrive and survive for thousands of years. And that was what I sort of had my eyes open to in Ladakh or or Western Tibet, where people had been living in this very difficult environment for thousands of years. And they'd managed to, thrive in a very harsh environment. And the fundamental difference between what they were doing and what happened in the modern economy is that they had developed ways of using those resources for their basic food, for their building materials, for fiber. All their basic needs were met through more localized, meaning adapted, or if you like, indigenous economic systems. And then with modernity, which we really have to look at, modernity starting with slavery and enclosures in Europe, where people were driven off the land forcibly by elites that at the same time engaged in forced slavery, genocide on other parts of the world. And a system was set up that favored those who were active globally. So even going back to the 1700s, and actually even before that, amassing wealth from around the world and gaining power and wealth through that, that's been the foundation of the modern economy. And this is why we need to step back and look at it in a systemic and holistic way to understand that it did not come about through some kind of natural evolutionary process. It didn't come about because a lot of these peoples around the world wanted to have strawberries in the winter and wanted to have imported food. It had very little to do with that. It had to do with the fact that there were elites that benefited through force from, driving people off the land onto huge monocultures, which already going back hundreds of years were very unhealthy.
And I know you have placed a lot of attention on food localization, and I'm curious why you found that to be a really powerful and beneficial entry point.
Well, first of all, I saw, the first, sort of impetus was actually seeing in this ancient culture of Ladakh or Western Tibet, which is this western part of Tibet that belongs politically to India and that had been sealed off from the modern world for political reasons. Before that, it was sealed off by the high Himalayas so that it was snowed in for about 8 months of the year. And then later in the modern era, because it was a part of Tibet that belonged politically to India, and the Indians did not want people up there in this very sensitive border area. So it was suddenly thrown open in the mid-70s, actually for political reasons, because the Indians wanted to place this part of Tibet on the map as belonging to India. And I came out as one of the first foreigners. I was a linguist. I went originally with a film team, but I absolutely fell in love with these people and learned to speak the language fairly quickly, started working on doing a dictionary and writing it down for the first time, the spoken language. And in the process, came across the most radiantly happy and equanimous people I had ever encountered, and just absolutely fell in love. And I saw that with the opening up to the outside world, the sudden influx of food from the other side of the Himalayas that had been transported for weeks meant that butter, for instance, came in selling for half the price of local butter. And I started looking at how this was possible. I started wondering, how is it possible that something that's been transported for 2 weeks can cost less than something that you can get from a 5-minute walk away? Mm-hmm. And I saw in a sort of holistic way and observing it over years that the modern path of progress, economic development, economic growth has been this extractive form of globalized capitalism. And again, as I said earlier, you have to go back to looking at its roots to understand how it's possible for this to happen. But it really is because we have, in effect, giant monopolies that have this completely unfair advantage over every localized business. So what I saw was that when you destroy people's ability to produce food for themselves in their own region, this is something that's extremely dangerous. And it's also quite crazy because food is the only thing that human beings produce that every single person on the planet needs every day. So when you create a system, which unfortunately, it's been built up over a long time, as I said, but now this is escalating, speeding up, getting worse. National governments are going along with policies that separate us further and further from the sources of our food. And actually, in that globalized food system, we have the main cause of climate change, the main cause of mountains of plastic, which are now proving not only disastrous for the environment, but also for our health. We have the main reason for ill health, including this epidemic of obesity and diabetes, heart disease, and cancer from pesticides, fungicides, herbicides. We have one of the main reasons for huge inequality and unemployment, financial insecurity. We have, when we look at this global food system, also a path of progress that separates us further and further from nature and further from each other. And in the process, further and further from ourselves, from our ability to listen to our own bodies, to our own hearts, to our own deeper feelings that, thank goodness, are guiding us back home towards reconnecting with nature. And what I saw in the traditional culture, which I then started promoting in the modern world, this reconnection with nature, particularly around local food systems, I have also been witness to it being one of the most healing paths for depression, for anxiety, for all kinds of trauma and problems.
You've been in this field for so long, and you seem to be able to remain compassionate and open. Even I never feel the kind of like daggers going, secret daggers going towards people. And how have you maintained that? Like, what is your personal way of remaining open?
Well, I guess if I ever get really annoyed, it's been more at my environmentalist colleagues, because I've felt that at that level, they've had more information and they should have been clearer about things. But really, I guess what I found, because I ended up in a very unique position, partly Ladakh was that's what opened my eyes to everything. And very few people had had that experience. So my baseline was very different. And I was literally moving back and forth from Ladakh to New York City, Paris, London. And each year as I came back, I think I saw the changes more clearly. And this is often why people who value our work have a lot of international experience and real grassroots international experience, not moving around the world as CEOs or diplomats, where they're often encased in their own world and worldview, and they often become more rigidly nationalist and globalist than those who've had a chance to live more at the grassroots and lead more normal lives. So I think that perspective made me more than anything just feel that people just weren't seeing it, and so I felt compelled to try to get this vision out, and I've been a thorn in many people's side, sort of trying to say, look at this, but and also because my book was translated into more than 40 languages, and I had contact with people around the world who shared this perspective, I had this sort of mandate and support from grassroots. And by the way, 90% women. It's very, very clear that women around the world, from Ladakh to Bhutan to South Korea to India to Sweden, women were more in tune with this questioning of essentially a techno-economic path. And I say techno-economic, money is also technology. So it's basically a technological path of man-made structures and ideas, which I would argue, emanate from far too narrow, over-specialized science. I see that combination of this over-specialization linked with scale and speed, which imposes monoculture, biological monoculture, human monoculture, and that is anti-life. Diversity is a fundamental principle of life. So I do feel, above all, just frustrated that it's so difficult to get this out. For many structural reasons, there has been a resistance to getting this bigger picture out. Maybe I could even just tell you one of the detailed examples. Seeing these changes in Ladakh, where people were being, pushed off the land into, building their houses out of cement, even though traditionally it was adobe, which is mud. You could never run out of mud in Ladakh. It was more than enough. Now suddenly they're dependent on imported cement and steel and plastic. And when I was seeing, now imported butter selling for half the price and all this, and I was going around the world saying, this is what's happening in the name of growth, in the name of economic development. Even your beloved microcredit is actually supporting this type of urbanization. Please, please wake up. But you've got to look at it in a more holistic way. And you have to look at food and farming to really see more clearly what's happening, to see what's happening to those farming communities. And I mean, it was just really unbelievable to see, the blindness to all of this, and to see how the language of the dominant institutions started changing. And one of the things that happened was that in giving these talks all around the world, especially not so much Australia, but Europe and North America, I ended up in the 90s, late 80s, 90s, with 4 award-winning documentary filmmakers who wanted to make a film with me. I was doing this with slideshows at that time. Every time I sat down to discuss it with them, they wanted to focus on a family or on a specific story of individual people. And I realized I would not be able to share this big picture about this transported food, about all this dependence on oil and the cement and the plastic. To do the bigger picture wasn't possible to do it through a story of a family. And I saw, already then how much these really well-intentioned documentary filmmakers were being influenced by a dominant narrative that was putting out a message that was actually dumbing us down. And to this day, people go on and on about what people learn from stories. They go on and on about how, people don't learn from information. That's so clear. We've been telling them about climate change and they're not doing anything to change. They don't realize that they're reinforcing ideas that are being put out there by the dominant institutions and preventing us from looking at the bigger picture. So in this case, with the story I was trying to tell, we ended up having to say no to award-winning documentary filmmakers and make the film ourselves to tell the big picture story. And that film and the book, my Ancient Futures book, between them, they were translated into more than 40 languages because there were people out there so hungry for the big picture. But try to get it into the media, try to get it on television. It happened to somehow get in the media in South Korea. And so my book's been a bestseller there, and I've been able to even meet, the president and the mayor of Seoul. And there's been a lot of interest, but especially in the English-speaking world, almost impossible to get it into the media.
And what do you attribute that to? I mean, obviously, you speak a lot about how the national governments are at the mercy of global banks and corporations. And so, do you feel like that is a reason why then the media is basically unable to open up to a more complex story?
Talking about we're all basically quite independent documentary filmmakers, but they had become so convinced that we need to really focus in on these personal stories to get the emotional reaction. And in many ways, they were right to make a good film. Possibly that's much better, to get the emotions going and everything. But in the meanwhile, the world is on fire. From my point of view, I was really saying, wake up, wake up. So it's a combination of well-funded think tanks that have actually been quite actively, detesting a lot of the environmental and grassroots ideas. Many times because they thought they were in the right. Many times because they were thinking these idealists have no idea. We are about employing people. We are about, being practical. Now, they weren't themselves forced to step back and say, well, actually, if you look at the numbers, you're creating unemployment. In the FAO, as part of the UN, feeding the world, you're actually creating hunger. But because there wasn't the money, in other words, from the grassroots, we didn't have big pots of money where we could sit down and do the studies that said, look here, here, here. And so what I've seen is this tragic situation where from the grassroots, people have generally been trying to protect their environment or their people from a system that was destroying both people and the environment. But they didn't have the means to see that from a global perspective. So, for instance, there are many examples of, that meant that they would often tend to blame the most visible, nearest enemy, as it were. And that could well be, people on the left blaming the Conservative Party, or on the people on the conservative side blaming the left. I mean, blaming the left, included things like, even in Australia, people say, well, the reason why the labor unions, lost out is because they were making far too many demands and they were being far too demanding, and then this is why business had to go off to China to produce. So that there would be 1,000,001 reasons that people were telling themselves, but they weren't looking at the bigger picture, where governments were ratifying trade treaties that committed them to support global companies over local or national. And that's what the trade treaties are about. But, there wasn't information about that. There wasn't people stepping back to say, wait a minute, we need to understand that everywhere in the world, food from the other side of the world is cheaper than local food. How can this be? So instead, like in America, reacting to the trade treaties, they would be called selfish because the powers that be would say, you are just greedy and selfish. You live in an industrialized, privileged country, and we are now helping India and Africa to get out of poverty. That's what globalization is about. And many people on the left believe that. So I had, strong criticism and attack from George Monbiot. Had a big debate with him, in the Ecologist magazine. He was actively anti-localization. But now in recent years, that's changing, thank goodness. But so there was a lot. So it's a mix of lots of well-intentioned people falling for a type of narrow analysis. And in the meanwhile, big money constructing a narrative that keeps people, away from the real causes. One of the most clear is in the climate debate, that big business came up with this idea that climate change is all about carbon, only carbon. And we're not even going to talk about fossil fuels, like in the climate negotiation, no mention even of fossil fuels. No, it's all about carbon. And that is a way of creating a tradable commodity that big business benefits from. And yet there are so few grassroots groups that address that. And then what happens? People on the right, small farmers, small business people, completely reject the climate issue as non-existent, rather than understanding that, yes, the way it's being framed is nonsense and very destructive. And I'd like to say one more thing about that, coming back to food. One of the most important things right now we could raise awareness about is that we have a regular import and export of identical products. And when it comes to food, that every single person on the planet needs 3 times a day, roughly, to import and export the same product, butter in, butter out, milk in, milk out, beef in, beef out. It's insanity. And then just today I was interviewed by a newspaper here in Australia, and they just wanted to maintain the idea that the reason that happens is because people prefer the imported product, and surely they must be better. Not understanding that when you see it from a global perspective, it's entirely about governments allowing monopolies to dominate, and that in doing so, they're destroying millions of jobs and the environment. That can sound so big and so impossible to change. And yet what I'm seeing, which gives me a lot of hope, is that quite intuitively, especially as I said, women are actually charting this journey back to nature, back home, to a closer relationship to nature, to community, and to themselves. So the sort of inner reconnection and the outer reconnections, which by the way go together, are happening. And I just think we need more clarity about how we can reinforce that in a more structural way by also looking at the economy.
Do you have any ideas of how to reinforce it in a more structured?
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. We're among other things, we'll be coming out with an action guide for local actions that you can take at the community level to support this economic trajectory, where, as we keep focusing a lot on the food, but that local food movement that is growing worldwide is so clearly demonstrating these win-win-win, that you shorten the distances, less pollution, less transport, less packaging, so less plastic. And people are starting to bring back returnable glass containers. They have to, however, be aware of also really clearly battling for changes in regulations, because big business brought in regulations that often prevent the reusing of glass bottles, for instance. And so we have this, so there are just a few things that people need to be more aware of. And there'll be a very clear path that goes beyond left and right, and that is so clearly beneficial for local jobs, for the local economy, for the environment, for rebuilding connection. And once people understand, particularly on the left, it's important that we're promoting this from a global perspective, globally. This is not some kind of, just happening in Portland with a bunch of elite people. This is something that's being supported worldwide. I think that we're seeing a real change, particularly from the left, towards supporting localization.
I'd love to hear about Ladakh. You've mentioned it here and there. I guess two parts around it. One, both your entry into the community and how, I imagine, as you said, you're the first Westerner that really spent time there. So I'm curious how you integrated into the community, and then also what you've seen as economics of happiness from Ladakh as a case study.
Oh, yeah. Well, the integration in Ladakh was just so easy. And I think in thinking back about it, I had actually been in San Cristobal de las Casas in Mexico, where the Zapatistas lived and, started their work. And there were 3 Indio tribes there, and I had been so moved by them, by their dignity and and beauty and so on. And then later on, when I ended up in Ladakh, I realized that a huge difference was that those Indios were probably exhibiting a certain skepticism of Europeans and, white people, because they'd been, pressured for, again, hundreds of years by the Spanish, whereas the Tibetans and the Bhutanese, the Ladakhis, had been protected by their mountains. And so they were just completely open, welcomed you with open arms. And so being the first person in living memory to learn the language, I was just loved. I mean, I was sort of known, I had sort of a Ladakhi name, Helena Dolma. And so everywhere I went, I said, oh, Helena Dolma, and the children would come running, and people, the region is quite big. It's about the size of Austria, but there were only about 100 villages with about 100,000 people. And so in this whole vast region, though, even when I go into a really remote village where you might only have 3 houses, in this whole valley, usually people would have heard of me. And if they hadn't, the minute I opened my mouth and spoke the language, they were all just thrilled because they hadn't had, someone else in living memory coming and learning their language. So that was, very easy. However, Ladakh was administered by Kashmir, Muslim Kashmir, belonging to central Indian government, but administered by Kashmir. And in both Kashmir, which was Muslim, and in New Delhi, the central administration, which was Hindu dominated, there was a lot of suspicion. And even in the second year there was an article in the Hindustan Times that said, how can they let this mysterious German woman who learned the language in a suspiciously short time, how can she be allowed to stay? Because they were very worried about spying. And so the idea was that I was a spy. And it was, for years and years and years, only until very recently, this was a huge burden and difficulty. And it's amazing that we were able to start these projects, which were actually critical of the government, because they were bringing in, among other things, DDT and pesticides that were outlawed in the West. And we were bringing in information about why they'd been banned elsewhere and why it was much better to stay organic. And they were bringing in fossil fuels and the cement and the plastic. And we were saying, no, there are natural local materials. And we did manage to get the support from relatively high up, from Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi and so on, to do some project. But there was always suspicion. I was always under surveillance and suspected of being a CIA agent. And later on, when there was tension between Buddhists and Muslims, I actually had to flee in the middle of the night because the Muslims in Kashmir were assuming that I had created this tension between the Buddhists and Muslims, and which was, the exact opposite of the truth, because I had noticed these tensions building up between Buddhists and Muslims, who, when I first arrived, I had been so moved to see how it was possible to have groups of people living side by side. Clearly, you're Buddhist, I'm Muslim, and yet we visit each other on our holy days, we support each other. We tend to avoid intermarriage, but there was also intermarriage, and sometimes not so welcome, but it was, there had never been group conflict, but it was because of the structural economic pressures that destroyed the local livelihoods, destroyed the local interdependence, and created this competition for scarce jobs that then led to friction between Buddhists and Muslims. And I had actually been organizing peace talks between the two groups. But anyway, so the integration with the people was no problem, but the suspicion from government was a problem.
When you did those peace talks, were you mediating?
Well, yes, in inviting groups to our center, we had this amazing sort of ecology center there to have discussions between Buddhists and Muslims to look at how to, both look at the reasons why and what to do to avoid further tension. It was very clear there, as in most places, that the tensions were particularly promoted by and experienced by young men. So it's often the women and the elders, who both were more spiritual, more commonsensical, who were trying to counsel against this. But I also experienced, even a Buddhist grandmother saying to me, we have no choice. We've got to kill all the Muslims, otherwise they're going to kill all of us. Mm-hmm. And I felt at that point in Ladakh that I was experiencing something of the fear and the hysteria, or even of Nazi Germany and of many other places where, people who would never have dreamed, would, become so irrationally fearful. We can see many examples of it around the world now.
And so what are some of the, I've seen your film, The Ancient Futures, the Ladakh film you have. Is that
have you? Yeah.
It's such a delight. I love that one. I sent it to my mother.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
The Ancient Futures film, or The Economics of Happiness?
Oh, Ancient Futures. Both.
Really? Okay.
But
have you seen Economics of Happiness?
Yes, I have seen that one.
Okay.
So in terms of being in Ladakh, it sounded like there was so much about the significance of local knowledge and cultural identity. Can you speak a little bit of that?
Yeah, I could say so many things about that. It was just so remarkable in the traditional context to realize how refined and deep the local knowledge was. So I can't remember whether I wrote about this in Ancient Futures, but when a farmer I knew in one village had lost his donkeys to wolves, and I was saying, but I just happened to be talking to this farmer in the neighboring village, and he has some extra donkeys, so maybe we can help, to. And he said, no way, they live down by the river where the soil is so much softer. Those donkeys are not adapted to our stony environment. So that they were aware that even where those donkeys had been born and bred, they were adapted to, soft river soil versus stony, desert environment. There were, so many examples of even like a particular species of barley only growing in this one village, again, a village of about 3 houses. And it was a barley that was, almost blue in color, and it tasted so much like wheat. It behaved a lot like wheat. So when you made bread out of it, it was so different. But all, building the houses, you had mud everywhere. Everywhere the buildings were made of stone, mud, and wood. But in some regions, you had to put straw in the mud to make it strong enough. In other regions, you didn't need that. In some, you could just make this amazingly, it was like child's play. They would just have like a little mold, and you put clay in it and patted it down a bit, let it sun dry, and then you built 3-4-story houses out of it. But in other places, you needed to ram the earth more, to make it stronger, depending again on what type of mud. I guess another very significant consequence of more localized ways of living. Now, again, here I'm talking about the traditional indigenous cultural way of living. Throughout the world, for most of our evolution, that's how we lived, and we lived in intergenerational communities. So we had this extended family where, every mother had something like 10 caretakers for every child, from the 5-year-old siblings to the 80-year-old uncles. There were always arms to carry the baby. The baby was always on somebody's body, but it wasn't just one mother alone, without anybody else. So in that existence, another aspect of local knowledge had to do with the fact that children grew up surrounded by people who knew them deeply, who knew them intimately, and who accepted them just the way they were. So they were not segregated into separate age groups, put into a system that was training them to constantly be better and better, and to train in an unnatural way to be producers in an unhealthy economy, an exploitative economy, both environmentally and socially exploitative. So what I came to realize was that perhaps in terms of mental health and human well-being, maybe the single most important thing was growing up surrounded by a group of people, all who, who valued you, who saw you for who you were, unique individual. There was a genuine individualism, genuine to the point where not only did they know you, with your name and so on, but they knew that you were changing from moment to moment, from year to year as you grew. So this deep, ongoing, intimate, localized knowledge of one another, it gave people what I think we all want, which is a sense of being connected and valued for who we are on the inside. We don't realize how, when we've been segregated into separate age groups, and we've been put into this almost like machine, and that machine has led to more and more speed and time pressure and more mobility. So as we become more and more globalized over a long period, we have had much more fleeting relationships with others. And those fleeting relationships mean inevitably that the superficial becomes important. It becomes important what you look like. Do you have a fancy car? Have you got a PhD? Have you got, a big house and a big, those superficial attributes, which have nothing to do with who you really are as an individual, become more and more important. And people are hiding inside a sort of shell of a nuclear family, where in that nuclear family, they feel that's the only place where people see me the way I really am. But the way we really are inside the nuclear family is unhealthily bipolar. When you have one man and one woman completely depending on each other for all their emotional needs, it's almost impossible to have balance. It's almost impossible that moment to moment, day to day, you're going to need each other equally. So then maybe one person is a bit more busy or away a bit, and the other one becomes insecure and wants more. And it's almost impossible to keep it stable. And then the same thing between the nuclear parents and the few children. The stresses and the strains and the expectations are so intense. And so that's, again, for me, it's one of the most, again, I just want us to try to get out this bigger picture of what we can really learn from indigenous cultures in that deeper way. And it's not about individual indigenous people, it's about the wholeness of life. It's about the everyday life. It's not about ceremonies and rituals, once a lifetime coming of age or something. We make too much of that, and we don't make enough of the everyday, of the ordinary, to learn from that. So what I saw was that the bigger group, it created this sort of basket of relationships where, if the husband was away for a long time, the wife wasn't, in great need, or, because there were so many others with whom to share and to care and to do the work. And for children growing up in that, the security, the deep self-confidence was such that the self wasn't an issue. What we talk about with ego is actually, it's a fearful retreat into trying to build ourselves up as a separate, important entity, because we've been told in our culture that if we can just become that bit more famous or that bit better than others, then we'll get the love we need. Just that little more wealthy, a bit more famous, and the opposite happens. It leads to separation and envy. So yeah, I just would love to blast that message across the world in the way that the AdWords blast exactly the opposite message, for children.
So beautiful. Well, Helena, I'm deeply grateful for your work and your devotion. And truly that piece that I was mentioning before that always draws me back to your work is your capacity for warmth and inclusivity. And it's so powerful right now in this realm of work. So I'm very much hoping many people become inspired to be a part of a world that many of us are not sure we want to be a part of, but that we can create something,
yes,
more worth it, more deepening, more connected.
Yeah, well, I'd love to stay in touch with you, and I hope you know about our World Localization Day. Do you?
Yes, I do.
You know about that, and I think because it was wonderful this year, to be working with so many groups on every continent and to try to nurture that seed of the smaller, the slower, the gentler, the fact that human beings thrive in an environment where they can collaborate. It's not that we're not all capable of fighting back if we're threatened, but we can actually create more collaborative environments. And I guess partly also what I want to say with the localization movement is working in that for so many years, I've discovered we don't actually have to come up with some completely new structure. We don't even have to abandon using the currency of our countries in order to create a new currency, and especially not by creating an internet currency. We can use the regular currency to start bringing people back in connection, again, particularly in the local food movement, but also with local business alliances and developing those relationships between the production and the consumption. And often it's not about eliminating the middleman. A lot of people think that you can have a really valuable institution of a shop that actually is supportive of whether it's the farmers or other producers, who are producing needed products in a more caring, often artisanal way. All of this stuff is happening all around the world, and I call them ancient futures trends, because we see this longing to work with nature to produce more natural products that are neither harming our health or the health of the environment. People want to do that. However, what will be helpful is if people are willing to, look at our localization materials and be willing to become a little more aware of the regulations, the structures of the dominant economy that are working against us, that we can, first of all, creatively try to work around, but we also need to start demanding change. And we can see that right now in this work that the local governments are beginning to respond to these demands from the bottom. Sort of the basic message is that the system we have does not come from human beings. On the contrary, it actually comes from what has become an inhuman structure. Inhuman in that there is no oversight. It's a lot of blind people, including at the grassroots, supporting a system that is strangling us. It's sort of like I often, some of the ideas that are being put out there with good intentions that help to reinforce that dominant system. It's just so sad because there are a lot of good people still putting them out there.
You say I'm just out of
well, yeah, the whole climate movement all going on about carbon, not knowing that it's actually many activists, including food activists, thinking that these regulations about food, are in the public sort of service, that they are about health and public safety. They're not. They've actually been brought in because big business sees that it's a way of destroying their smaller counterparts. And then once you realize that the people who are doing that, who are lobbying Congress, for instance, to bring in those changes, even they are not fully aware of the damage they're doing. They're just there to support their big business and to lobby for it. They don't have to sit down and face that, oh, you know, today with this stroke of the pen, I've just killed, you know, X number of businesses and with it, you know, created all this poverty and unemployment and pollution. So they, yeah, so it's just so many examples of the lack of the big picture, allowing both activists at the bottom and government and business people at the top to continue reinforcing and supporting the system. I mean, one of them now is the Green New Deal. You know, so many good people are in favor of that because they're not looking in a holistic way, in a deeper way, and not looking at what actually is being put in, you know, practically in place. And so it is tricky that to wake up to that. And then on the right now, we have more and more people who are very suspicious, but they are developing a suspicion that only wants government out of the way. They're not understanding that this has to do with economic business structures behind the scene. And by disempowering government, they're making that de facto economic government more powerful. And they are also, you know, contributing to this poisonous polarization. And in almost every instance, I would argue that the politics of identity, you know, the politics which suddenly says, if you're interested in food and farming, well, then we must only listen to the farmers. Big problem, because so many of the farmers haven't actually been looking at the bigger picture, and many of them just trying to survive. Or whether it's now attacking philanthropy, because there are many philanthropists that have been doing, you know, pretty unhelpful or even destructive things, but actually philanthropy per se is not the problem. You know, we could have really needed philanthropy, particularly in this climate. Also distinguishing now, you know, if you're black or white or indigenous or not, male, female, all these categories of a politics of identity, generally dividing people rather than bringing us together. And that doesn't at all mean that we shouldn't be looking at the plight of people who are being, you know, have faced horrible, you know, prejudice and so on. But how do we do that in a way that doesn't feed into the big machine?